We're glad you've joined us. Today, we're talking about the lessons learned from recent cyber breaches with Adam Gordon and Dr. Hernan Murdoch. Adam is an IT author, auditor, and consultant focused on working globally with the Fortune 500. He works across multiple industry sectors with a focus on security, cloud, and infrastructure. Additionally, he holds over 160 certifications and is an edutainer at IT Pro TV and ACI Learning Company. Hernan speaks at conferences in the U.S. and abroad. He's the author of numerous articles and books on a variety of topics, including internal audit, fraud, and more. He holds professional designations as a CIA and CRMA, and he currently serves as our Vice President of Audit Content here at ACI Learning. Prior to that, he was a senior project manager leading audit and consulting projects for clients in the manufacturing, transportation, high-tech, education, insurance, and power generation industries. So what exactly is ACI Learning? ACI Learning trains leaders in audit, cybersecurity, and IT. We deliver a lifetime learning experience to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. We'd love to get questions from you as we go along, so please put your questions in the chat panel in Zoom, and we'll get to them after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. You can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links in the handouts panel. Now, let's welcome Adam and Hernan to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Where would you like to begin?
Hello, Adam. How are you today?
I'm good, Hernan. How are you?
I am well, thank you. Well, I want to spend a few moments talking with you about a topic that's on many people's minds, right? We're talking about cybersecurity. And depending on who you ask and which report you reference, the numbers are somewhat striking, if not alarming, right? I just give you a few numbers, and then we can dig in a little bit further into this. But some reports indicate that we're looking at about a 70% rise in year-over-year incidents and breaches and such. We're talking about ranges of damage cost-wise from anywhere from $4.5 million to $9 million, anything from as average cost, and anything from $40 million to $400 million in terms of total cost. We're looking at numbers that are really staggering, in my opinion. We're looking at 37 billion records exposed in 2020, based on a quick view report that looks at year-end data breaches. So 37 billion records exposed. So with that setting the stage, what's your take about this? How bad is it? And what are kind of the things that we need to be aware of as individuals, but also, of course, as professionals who are in many cases tasked, because as auditors, compliance professionals, and IT security experts, we're looking at how do we help protect the organizations where we work. So how do you see this?
All right, so let's begin with maybe the broad strokes, right? So you painted a picture for us, lots of seemingly, and I think it's fair to say actual chaos going on right out there. Compound that with disruptions in global supply chains that we've seen over the last several years. Compound that with a global pandemic that, although it is certainly not as significant and serious as it was at the height, is still very serious and still causing disruptions. And potentially, of course, the butterfly effect, right? We see from all of that in the global economy and the disruptions that just continue to go on daily, right, around all sorts of other things. It's fair to say there's a lot happening. And while in some respects for audit professionals, for IT and IT security professionals, many of the things that we focus on have not changed. But I think it's also fair to say that the scope, the impact, and of course the liabilities associated with those actions continue to be amplified, right, in almost every way that we see. The range of activity from bad actors, from threat sources, has continued to multiply. The number of breaches has, as you've said, startlingly gone up year over year, an over 70% rise over, at least for the period of the last full year from 2020 to 2021, as you can see, that we have accurate data for. That number, by the way, is trending to be on target and even probably as disruptive, if not more so, year over year from 2021 into and through 2022. We're near the end of the three-quarter way point through 2022, and the numbers are equally troubling in 2022. And the amount of damage that is done on average, depending on the size of the breach, continues to be staggering. I think when we pair that with the concerns we see in the insurance markets around the tightening of requirements and the scoping of the definition around what cyber breach insurance may and ultimately may not cover, it gives us all pause. I think, Hernan, you and I will probably have a lot of things to say about this broader issue with regards to third-party risk and transference as we go through our discussions. But I think opening up, right, as we begin to really think about this, the amount of data that is being exposed and the dwell time on average that individual bad actors are able to achieve and to stay in an organization is one thing, but to stay unrecognized, essentially undiscovered, for perhaps up to a year while you're able to seek and find large volumes of information, layouts of the land, so to speak, and understand where everything is, who everybody is, and what value that information may bring to people that you have access to that want that information, and you can provide it to as a bad actor. These are troubling times. And I think as IT and audit professionals, it's incumbent on us, all of us, wherever you come from, whatever your focus is, to not only understand the scope of what we're seeing as an ever-emerging and ongoing trend, but it's also important for us to think about the reasons why this is happening, as Hernan challenged us. And it's important to understand that this is the culmination, unfortunately, in many respects, of a lot of time we've spent ignoring best practices, allowing issues and concerns that we know are problematic to go unchallenged because we've been distracted by other things. And I think, Hernan, the initial and probably easiest low-hanging fruit answer to your first question is, it's incumbent on us, and ultimately I think it is us. When we look inside organizations, auditors that, for whatever reason, are not calling out red flags when they are found. We have examples of that in some of the discussions we'll have here, whether it's because they're distracted by the state of the organization they're auditing, or they're distracted by guidance from senior leadership that is indicating to them that things are perhaps not what they seem to be, and as a result are not challenging those assumptions and that information. I think that's an issue. I think IT professionals that know better and are not following best practice guidance because they're being told or for whatever reason are finding ways to avoid having to implement those policies or are being told they shouldn't have to, and here's why. It's one thing to say, I'll follow somebody who gives me guidance. It's another thing to say, I'll jump off a cliff when you tell me to. And I tell my customers all the time, just because it sounds like a good idea at the time doesn't mean it is. And you have to have a longer-term vision of what risk management is in an organization to be good at what we are challenged by and ultimately being paid to do as information security and audit professionals. So I think it's a combination of things, but I think it's things we could address if we spend time recalibrating and understanding more of what we see in front of us and really being not only willing to challenge those assumptions, but willing to understand the implications if we don't.
So on that note, as we're talking about challenges and things that have forced all of us to react very quickly to different dynamics, one of them, of course, is the pandemic, right, COVID. But one of the things that has come as a result of that is the work from home dynamic, right, the remote workforce. So when we look at some of the numbers specific to that, that becomes also a factor or a vector that has been identified as a troublesome dynamic there. And we're talking about almost $5 million based on one of the reports that I was looking at, associated with that, which is 1 million more than it was the previous year. So going back to your point. So how do you see this dynamic? Because you highlighted something that I believe is important to touch upon, which is how we have reacted to it. Some of it has been legislated, but for the most part, a lot of it has been organizations trying to do what's right for their employees, for their customers, for their vendors. And a lot of it has resulted in people working remotely. How has that complicated this dynamic?
So, when we work remotely, and, I often marvel at the fact that in the last, let's say about 2.5 years now, right, that we've been dealing with the fallout from specifically the COVID pandemic. When we think about working remotely, it seems to me, and I find this shocking, to be honest with you, that everybody looked at this and said, okay, we have to figure out a way to safeguard people. We're going to start working remotely. We can't be in large groups, in enclosed spaces. I have no trouble with any of that. I think that was the absolute right way to go. But, people then took this idea of working remotely as if it was something brand new, that nobody had ever done this before. And as a result of that, they changed the dynamic in the playbook and said, well, we don't know what to do. We've never had people work remotely before. I get the fact that at scale, we've been challenged as organizations to enable remote work. Right. I definitely get that, and I don't disagree with that. But remote work is not a new thing. People have been working remotely for a very long time. And to say that we don't really understand as IT professionals focused on security, that we don't understand as audit professionals focused on governance, on risk management, on compliance, the classic GRC acronym we all hear and live every day in this world, right, that we all operate in, to say that we don't understand and at scale are not equipped to manage that, I don't agree with. I think there definitely are stresses in that system. I think there are things that have to be done differently. And I think for the most part, many companies, to your point, have figured out how to do those things, enabling their workforces and individuals as well as collectives to not only be more productive, but to be more secure and to be safer and healthier in the process. All of those are good outcomes. But I think we also have examples of companies, whether it's because of a lack of internal guidance, vision, and or understanding, or because industries have not necessarily all taken to this the same way. I think there's a combination of factors, but I think we have examples of companies where there has not been, unfortunately, as great a success with regards to working remotely. We've had issues where people have practiced the exact opposite of what we would think of as cybersecurity hygiene and best practices. They've become lax, even though they've been trained to do things a certain way. Well, I'm at home. What could possibly go wrong? I'm at home. Right. What bad actors are possibly going to get into my system? I don't have to worry about locking my machine when I walk away from it. I don't have to worry about making sure I'm connected to the appropriate wireless access point with the appropriate security settings, and I don't have to use a VPN to access corporate data because I'm home. Who's going to hack into my system? Well, people get hacked into at home every day, and this is not an uncommon thing. Oh, I'm going to work remotely. I'm going to work from a public area. I'll use public Wi-Fi. I don't have to worry about that. Who's going to hack into my system when I'm at Starbucks or wherever the case may be? Not that Starbucks is any more or any less secure than anybody else, right? But the point is it's public Wi-Fi. You don't know who is sitting on that wireless access point with you, around you, near you. There are people in this, in the space you're in. You don't know what their intentions are. There are people outside that space that you don't see. It's the same thing in airports, same thing in hotels. The list goes on. I think when we think about how companies have reacted, I think the big issue for many companies, the blind spot that many of them unfortunately did not see or were late to understand and address, was a reinforcement of security awareness training and security awareness best practices to switch the focus to make sure every employee, every team member, every individual, whatever those people are referred to as in those organizations, that all of them had the benefit and the knowledge to understand how to operate in this seemingly brave new world, but really just reorienting what we already know and what we think we know to ensure that we're acting appropriately given the operational environments we live in. When we go remote, and I travel all over the world, right, to do what I do. Hernan, I know you travel a lot as well. Many of you listening to us do. Those that travel have a good sense of how to operate in a remote world because you have to be hyper aware of what's going on around you. You have to question things that other people may take for granted when they're in a fixed environment that is controlled because everything is strange. Nothing around you is certain and nothing around you is known. And I think these are things we missed the ball on, so to speak, right? We dropped that ball. We didn't reinforce that learning and that expectation for remote workers. And I think we unfortunately paid the price. We see this uptick in cyber breaches, and part of it is directly attributable to the shift to remote work. But I think people also make the assumption incorrectly that the majority of it is due to the uptick and the change to remote work. And the facts just don't really bear that out. I think it's fair to say there is a percentage hike that is attributable directly to the shift to remote work, but the majority of the uptick is attributable to other factors that combine with remote work. And I think it's beyond the scope of our ability to deal with all of them together to have an impact, but I think it is site-specific. Companies that face certain issues should address those issues head-on and make sure their employees are trained appropriately.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in many cases at the very beginning of this whole transition, that a lot of the focus was on giving people access to the tools they needed to do their work. And cybersecurity perhaps was not given the attention it deserved at the time. But here we are trying to raise awareness about it and also take a look at some of the dynamics that have played out so that we can benefit from the lessons learned. So let's do some of that now more specifically by looking at some specific cases. So, for example, we had a dynamic that played out over affecting Neiman Marcus in particular, and that had to do with payment cards, not necessarily their own, but cards that people used in general, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and so on. And what we had happen there was, and by the way, gift cards as well. So those are compromised. And one of the dynamics that caught my attention with it was the amount of time it took for the organization to find out that this had happened. So we're talking about 5 million customers, over 3 million payment cards. But the breach happened in May 2020, but it was not discovered until September 2021. So we're talking over a year. And a report that I was looking at said that the number of days to detection is about 277 days, which, by the way, we see the same dynamic played out in the space around fraud, where it takes over a year on average for fraud to be detected. And one thing that, again, brings the two dynamics together is that the cost increases with time. So the longer it takes to detect the breach, the higher the cost is to the organization. So how about we take a little bit of time to talk a bit about what happened there with these payment cards, gift cards as well, and the time to detection. What's your take on that?
So, it's a great initial discussion point, initial case study, right? And it's a unique one in some respects. I hinted at this in our opening remarks when I said, the financial state or state of the organization does play a part when we think about auditing and where we come from, the information we're being given, in potentially what we flag as auditors or what we're comfortable reporting on, let's say, as findings, and what we may dismiss or perhaps put off in a holding pattern, right? Because we're not clear on or cannot substantiate one way or the other what is happening. And I see this a lot in customers I deal with and audits I'm involved with. And Hernan, I know you certainly have had a lot of experience with this over the years as well. But this was a unique case. Neiman Marcus, during the time when the breach initially occurred, and the over year, it was probably a year and a half approximately, until they came forward and claimed, and I'm not suggesting they did or did not spend that amount of time to actually figure it out, but they claimed that they then discovered the breach almost a year and a half later. I question that timing. I think they knew about it earlier. I think September is the watermark where they reported it to law enforcement. I think internally they had some rumblings about it a little bit earlier. But that aside, this is a unique case because they actually were in the middle of a bankruptcy filing when all of this was taking place. And I think, and it's fair to say, that this caused a disruption in normal operational activities. This caused a hyper-focus in the organization on things that clearly distracted from the ability to understand what was happening in the systems that they had to monitor to find evidence of this breach and to then take action. And I think, although it's a unique case because most companies are not in the middle of a bankruptcy filing when they happen to be attacked and are breached, although it does happen, I think it brings to light an interesting point, which is, the amount of time it took for this to come to light, I think we can say was amplified and was compounded, was extended by the fact that this company was in turmoil, financial chaos. They were essentially spiraling uncontrollably toward bankruptcy. They had filed at that point. They were going through the initial motions with the court to figure out what that would look like. They clearly were not operating under normal constraints and conditions. And I think it's probably fair to say they were not following a normal audit schedule as a result. And because of those things, I think we see the evidence of that. The dwell time was substantially elongated before the breach was discovered. And although we don't know for a fact whether that impacted their ability to then remotely understand what was happening, on the ground understand what was happening, and then transmit that to law enforcement in a timely fashion, I find it hard to understand how that breach took almost a year and a half to diagnose, I'll be honest with you. But when they did finally get evidence of it and they did report it out, it was then difficult to understand the true depth because of the chaos and all of the things that were happening. They think the majority of those cards that you mentioned were inactive, but they're not sure. They believe that minimal customer data may have been affected because there were not some of the unique identifying PII factors that would link the data that was exposed to being actionable. But then we also see evidence of the fact that the data dump may have been actually put out on the dark web and used or at least accessible to other people for other activity. So there's a lot of conflicting conversations and narrative right around this breach. But I think it's fair to say that the chaos caused by a bankruptcy filing definitely took senior leadership's eyes off the ball. And the mid-level managers, the people that should have been on guard for risk behavior and to bubble this up, were not paying attention, or they would have seen this sooner. And I think as auditors, it's incumbent on all of us to understand, we can only operate within the constraints of the organization and how they allow us to. If we're not given access, if we're not told come in, if we're not given the full picture, it's very hard for us to take out a crystal ball and imagine the future and tell you what it's going to be, because we don't know. People often have this confusing idea that auditors know everything and we tell all. We know what you tell us. We verify to the extent that we feel comfortable standing on that material, what you tell us to be true or not true. But we're not going to tell stories just because somebody said something. Quite the opposite. We're very cautious about doing the exact opposite of that. Because of that, it is, I think, unfortunate that in some respects, auditors often get a bad rap, right? We get the blame for not being able to sound the alarm earlier in this storyline, when in fact, it's probably fair to say that auditors had no idea this was going on because they did not have access to the company and did not have access to the information necessary to make a determination, or this would have come to light sooner. And I think it points out the chaos that this kind of disruption can cause in organizations and the lack of safeguards that are often built in for IT systems to be able to then alert all of us that something is happening, even if auditors don't have eyes on. And I think that's one of the pivot points we probably want to spend a little time on.
Yes. So, Adam, thinking in terms of the specifics of Neiman Marcus, and I agree with you that definitely it looks as though the dynamics around the solvency of the organization played a role. But I'm looking at one of the things that you highlighted there in terms of the frequency with which auditors and other cybersecurity experts are able to look at what's happening within the organization, whether they have the resources, they have the focus, the priorities given to their work. And I'm thinking back to that 277 days, because that came from an IBM report. So this problem seems to be fairly widespread. Again, it goes back to the methodology used during the study that they did. But the fact that it goes over almost a year suggests to me that perhaps you're onto something when you talk about the resources, the focus, the priorities, the accessibility that auditors and others have to do the work that they need to do, and how much this needs to be made a priority and properly resourced. Because it seems to me as though we have a bit of a systemic dynamic that we need to keep our eyes on.
I think we do, and I've been a big advocate for many, many years of the change that I think needs to occur, right, within the audit space, or one of them anyway. You could argue there are several, but I think this one in particular would make a huge difference and would help us to figure out how to shorten this dwell time statistic. 270 days on average. On average, it's actually probably closer to a year. For most, when we look at major breaches, we see it's over a year. I think one of the blind spots organizations have, and I think we can address with a change, is the fact that for some of our, and indeed depending on how you define threat intelligence and risk management, perhaps for a lot of the reporting and the standardization, as well as the regulatory compliance around these activities, we rely on a once-a-year audit. And although we may do pre-audit work, we may do internal audits that are incremental in their ability to help us move the ball forward and understand where we are in relation to passing that once-a-year audit, the reality is that full audit takes place on average once a year for most organizations. And while I don't advocate changing that status and that cadence, what I do think makes a lot of sense is that we need to spend more time in the interim period between those audit activities that are full-on audits that expose these issues and can bring them to light, spending time understanding what's happening in the organization. If risk managers, whatever we call them in organizations, whether they're CROs, chief risk officers, chief data officers, chief protection officers, the list of acronyms changes and updates frequently. But whoever those professionals are, the information assurance and risk management professionals in organizations internally, including the internal audit teams of large enough organizations that have them, if they were spending more time in the intervening time periods, examining and understanding the flow of activity against what the standards for audit will look like in that yearly activity cycle, I think we would find more evidence and be able to interdict sooner. I think the challenge is resources. I think the challenge is focus. And I think the challenge is, like everything, right? It's a question of dollars and how we allocate them and spend them. The reason I think we see a lot of automation in the space of threat intelligence and risk management and monitoring is because we don't have enough dollars and enough humans to do the job because of the amount of information that's constantly in play in organizations. But I think we need to get better at understanding how to look continuously instead of looking incrementally, because I think that's where blind spots occur. We don't know it's happening because the incremental changes that are occurring that would indicate to us that a bad actor is in a system and is dwelling for a long period of time are missed until we do a full-scale review, or until it gets so significantly impactful that we can't ignore those warning signs, right? Those IOCs, those indicators of compromise, and we can't dismiss them or push them away and say, oh, well, it's probably just this ghost or that thing, and we don't see the strings coming together to form the actual tapestry. We just see the individual threads that don't be, unfortunately, not very meaningful to us. So I think it does require a shift in focus, but I also am realistic enough to understand that resourcing is probably going to be the constraint, and it's very hard to put that into action. But I do think it's an important point and an important observation we want to make. How do we challenge organizations to pay more attention between cycles so that they can be better prepared, as opposed to waiting to be told that things are bad?
Right, exactly. I totally agree. The profession has been talking about continuous monitoring and continuous auditing for quite some time now, and this is definitely a good example of the need to visit that, look at that, and avail ourselves of the technology that will help us do these type of things. Another important thing for our viewers is to please make sure to write your questions and submit those to us. We would love to hear your questions and answer them during the Q&A session towards the end of today's program. So let's turn our attention to another dynamic, Adam, that caught my eye, and that has to do with Amazon Web Services, AWS. And a lot of organizations use S3 buckets. It become very, very commonly used for to support the organization, all the different features and flexibility that it provides. However, we have a number of examples where, because of configuration issues, data was compromised. And I'll just give you some names, but there are so many that definitely feed into this topic. Capital One, Pegasus Airlines, FlexBooker, which provided travel services, Senior Advisor, which was providing services to senior citizens, Maps Online, and their work with municipalities around the country. So, and the list goes on. So, S3 buckets and AWS are very, very common tool used by organizations, but then we need to ask ourselves about the configuration and the security around it. So what are some of the key takeaways from that dynamic that is so troublesome?
Sure. So, when we think about S3 buckets and more broadly about cloud services, let's not make this about just one provider, because it is a much broader conversation in many respects. Although AWS has also, unfortunately, become in some respects the representative leader in the discussion, just because they are often the target of breaches in the S3 buckets in the storage space. But to be fair, Google Cloud, Oracle, Microsoft on Azure, and certainly Dell, which now owns VMware and a bunch of additional cloud services and capabilities, have all had major issues, as well as technology providers like Apple, Cisco, and the list goes on. So there really are not any companies out there that totally escape being covered with this particular brush when we think about these issues. But when we think about Amazon in particular and S3 buckets, I think it's fair to say that when we look back over, and let's just use a defined period of time, a 5-year span from now, 2022, let's go back 5 years to 2017. Let's think about what we've seen. You may or may not be familiar, those of you listening to Hernan and I, as we're having this conversation, or listening to us later, on the playback after it's been recorded. But those of you that may or may not be familiar with some of the names of the companies that he just kind of went down as a laundry list of companies that have had significant S3 breaches. And by the way, many of them were in the last 24 months. But if we go back 5 years, that list is substantially longer. And when we look, and I did a quick calculation of what the total number of individual unique customer records was that was essentially exposed or found to have been breached during that 5-year period, it's over 500 million, right, just across the breaches that
wow.
we would list on a short list, let alone the broader list, which is going to be over billions, right, and billions. Some of these breaches involve a billion or more records when we think about mega breaches. But when you think about the fact that over a 5-year period, and that is a shockingly long period of time, when we think about the technology and how it changes in cloud services, that this has been going on, and this has actually been going on longer than 5 years on the Amazon side with S3 buckets, to be fair, but also to create accountability where accountability is required in this conversation. All cloud providers have issues, but Amazon in particular, unfortunately, because of where they came from and the unique thought process behind their cloud services, which is first and foremost, as they started out, they were a technology company that got into cloud and really looked to make cloud accessible to the average individual as well as the business, right? And I think that's great, don't get me wrong. But you've got, unfortunately, in some respects, a consumer mindset that governs the enterprise space in AWS. Much like you have in Apple with Apple products, where it's a consumer-focused company, and as a result, they make choices about how things are done and the way things are configured that benefit individuals, that may or may not necessarily benefit companies. And the use of S3 buckets is a good example. The default setting for a long time was to allow S3 buckets to be made available publicly and to rely on individuals and companies to then have to lock those down. In other words, put the burden, the onus of compliance on the company as opposed to the provider. Now, you may or may not agree with that, and you may or may not think that's a good or bad idea. We're not here to debate that. I'm just here to simply state that that was the case. And because of that, early on, we saw a lot of breaches occurring because companies didn't really understand that, nor did they really understand the implications of not taking action in that case. And today, right, even now, we still see companies with unsecured S3 buckets that are exposing, in the case of Pegasus Airlines, you mentioned, 6.5, almost 6.5 terabytes of data were found in that open S3 bucket before it was reported to the company and ultimately secured. Now, while you may say, I don't even know who Pegasus Airlines is, let alone what they do, and what kind of information could they possibly have? Well, they had a lot of information about where their planes fly, how they fly, what they do. That may or may not be important to any of us, but I promise you it may be important to bad actors looking to impact the operation of those airlines. It may be important to, and I hate to say this, and I don't want to say it in a negative way, but to people looking to do harm, right? Whatever those people are, wherever they are, whatever their agenda may be. They had sensitive proprietary information about how they operate their internal systems, and PII, personally identifiable information, about members of their teams and their air crews, any and all of which could be used to blackmail or compromise security at an airline, and to then gain access to systems that could cause havoc, and let's be honest, cause death and destruction for a lot of people, especially if you take over an airline. So the reality is this is a significant issue, a significant security liability, one that for whatever reason was left unattended and nobody knew about it until someone else found it and reported it to the company. Now, to their credit, they took action immediately and secured that S3 bucket once they were made aware. But I think it speaks to the broader issue of the fact that when default settings and configurations are not managed from a risk mitigation and security standpoint, we have issues. And if you allow and rely on people that may not necessarily be trained to do these things, to make those decisions, you wind up with bad outcomes. I mean, this is the basics of IT security, the basics of audit, and the basics of common sense 101, right? People that aren't trained, that don't understand the implications of actions, are less likely to make good choices and, as a result, achieve good outcomes. So I think it's fair to say, while we can't lay all the blame at the doorstep of any one company, AWS is not exclusively to blame for any of this. Their customers are equally, if not more culpable than they are. But the reality is, we have a multi-year track record of these things occurring, and nobody seems to be paying attention, because I can tell you, without having a crystal ball, that we'll have another 3 or 4 of these between now and the end of 2022. And we'll probably have a significant amount of them next year and the year after. And companies are not paying attention to the headlines. They are not training their people and doing an internal risk assessment around their infrastructure. The first question I ask and I talk about with my customers when I see one of these headlines is, hey, what infrastructure do you have that would essentially make you the next fill in the blank? Pegasus, right? Whatever the case may be. We're not picking on Pegasus, just one of many companies in this particular conversation. But are we going to be the next one? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Let's focus on mitigating the reasons why, and let's reinforce the actions that are causing us to say why not, and let's make sure we're not on the cover of the next major breach report, because we don't want to be that company. You, your people, your organization, you don't want to be that person. It's a very tough position to be in, and it's a very difficult conversation to have with stakeholders, with regulators, and with customers. None of those are comfortable, and none of them end well. So Hernan, I think there's a lot of value in what we're talking about here, but I think it is important also to broaden it to all cloud providers and all customers. The reason we have contractual obligation documents like SLAs is because we have to hold each other accountable. I think we should have risk management contracts that force customers to follow best practices and rely on the tooling and the best practice settings to be integrated, as, to be fair, cloud customers may not be able to do, the cloud providers are starting to do. And if we put those two things together, I think we're making significant inroads and really making a giant step forward here.
I agree. I believe that there needs to be more clarity around roles and responsibilities, and something that we've been talking in audit for a long time, and that is that you can outsource the activity and you can avail yourself of services from vendors, but you don't excuse yourself from the risk that that may carry. You still need to take ownership and responsibility as an organization for protecting your data. And as we're talking about using these widely used services, cloud services, like you mentioned, we need to be mindful about who is configuring these things, who is making sure that we are keeping an eye on who's accessing, who's not, and how we protect the data. Because at the end of the day, it's our customer data, it's our employee data, our data we need to, those are our assets. So that becomes very important. Now, building on that in terms of the vendors, because there's that third case I would like to bring to our conversation briefly, and that's one of the retailers, Kroger. And they were using a third-party file transfer software. Now, the software was old. The provider indicated that it was near end of life at that point. So then we start to question some of the security features that may not have been built into it, because that's another challenge with very old systems and software that may not have all the security built in like newer software might. They submitted the patches and that was improved and fixed. However, I believe there's a lesson there as well. As organizations hire vendors, and in this case, software companies, to help with their file transfer protocols and transferring data and files, they need to also understand what that means and how we're going to go about some of the things that you mentioned earlier, Adam, which has to do with their risk, with the security, with the insurance, what protocols and conventions and best practices are being used. So let's dig a little bit on this one as well. How about the third-party role as relates to this?
So I think the best place to start with this is to be a little bit more, let's tell a little bit more of a transparent story around this particular event, right? And you're doing a great job of narrating it, but there's a couple of things I want to highlight and bring to the surface here as we get into third-party culpability, right? And how we address and potentially deal with cybersecurity and cyber supply chain risk management. So yes, Kroger, relying on a third party, Acelion is the name of the company, they're California-based, that developed and was instrumental in marketing and actually deploying this particular product called FTA, which was their file transfer piece of software for large, we're talking about mega large data transfers, right? So you're not sending a 20 megabyte file via email. We're talking about transferring hundreds of megabytes, perhaps a gigabyte or more of data. Think about FTP on steroids, right? Essentially, right, is what this kind of a solution would be. And there's nothing wrong with that. Company has a great, solid track record, makes good products. But here's the problem. The program was nearing end of life. It was 20 years old. Now, think about what's 20 years old in relation to IT. We have operating systems that have been around approximately that long. Windows 7 would be a really good example of that. But it's an outlier. Most operating systems are not maintained in market for near that long. We have browsers that have been around approximately that long. Internet Explorer was finally just end-of-lifed earlier in the last year approximately. And when you think about hardware, almost without exception, in an average IT organization, we do not have hardware that is a decade old, let alone 2 decades old, that is in service. There are rare exceptions, and certainly there are use cases in certain industries, in manufacturing, in healthcare, where we do have software and hardware that may certainly be a decade or more old because of a variety of issues, constraints, regulatory requirements, things like that. But on average, in most companies, that is not the case. And yet we allow software that is 20 years old to move some proprietary, and in this case, highly secure data for not just Kroger, but for many, many customers of this particular company who are using this product. And then we get shocked when there's a data breach because 20-year-old software, how could that not be secure? Now, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but here's the problem with this, right? Who's doing the risk assessment on using a 20-year-old file transfer program and deciding that this is a good idea? I promise you it was nobody, or this would have ended differently. And I think it's fair to say that the gap here is not just about managing third-party supply chain, cybersecurity, supply chain risk, whatever you want to refer to it as. We often refer to it as TPRM, third-party risk management, right? But whatever we call it these days, it is definitely having a point person or a point entity within the organization to be aware of that. Absolutely. But here's the problem. Most organizations don't. Most organizations are understaffed, underfunded, and overworked to begin with, especially small and medium-sized ones. And it's very hard for them to understand where these risks may lie. And it's also equally unfair to say, well, then auditors should fill the gap because auditors can tell you this. Auditors will act in your best interest to make these recommendations. Well, the same companies that are understaffed, overworked, and under-resourced and don't get this because they don't know how and are not able to understand just because they just can't see it, they probably are not having audits done on a regular, if at all, basis because they're small and they're probably flying under the radar. So to say, well, we'll fill the gap with auditing is nice, and that works for very large companies that have audits that are scheduled, but it doesn't work for the large portion of companies in that space that are not auditing on a regular, if at all, basis. I think it's a combination of things, right? When we look at third-party risk management and supply chain risk management today, I think it's an extension of the awareness and the awakening that we've seen that risk is not a single fight in a single location that we win or lose. Risk is an ongoing battle that is fought across the operational landscape of organizations that we now understand fundamentally and irrevocably is incorporating our supply chains. If I, as a company, as an owner, as an employer, or as a worker in a company am making good decisions and I am secure, I am one link in a very long chain. And if my partners, my vendors, my suppliers are making bad decisions or are unaware of the decisions and the implications they are making, I own those, whether I'm aware of them, whether I see them, whether they run over me or they run around me. I own them even though I may not know what they are. I don't have visibility often, but I am on the receiving end of the liability even though I don't have visibility. And I think, Hernan, to your point, this is the crux of the argument, right? In this particular case study, Kroger didn't do anything wrong, quite the opposite. But one of their partners, one of their suppliers made bad choices and left a product in market too long that they knew was nearing not only end of life, but was unfortunately woefully inadequate and not secure enough to deal with the kind of issues that had to be addressed. But they allowed it to be used and did not offer guidance on the fact that the product may not be as secure as it should be. And as a result, that there may need to be another option that vendors and or consumers should think about. Who wants to tell customers, hey, you know what, we're not good for you anymore. Go spend your money somewhere else, right? That's not how you make money. It's not how you stay in business. I get that, right? I totally get that. But here's the downside, right? By not doing that, by not being transparent, what have you done? You've caused even more chaos and more concern for your customers, and you've caused a breach that, although it may or may not be impactful to you as the company, is impactful to your customers. That's probably a worse place to find yourself. I think customers would value transparency and honesty more so than they would value you not telling them that you know something is going on and working with them to try to solve it. And I talk with customers about this all the time. It's okay to say no once in a while, as long as you have a side conversation about what it means and how you're going to move towards ultimately trying to figure out how to say yes. And we may not be able to say yes to every outcome, but we can say we're going to figure out what the best path forward is. And I think the secret to supply chain and third-party risk management is the broadening of that accountability, responsibility conversation about transparency and about what best practices are being implemented downstream. I tell my customers and the people I work for and work with all the time, hey, you know what? We're auditing you to a certain standard. Are you auditing your suppliers to that same standard? Are you holding them accountable contractually to the same standards you hold yourself accountable to? And if not, why not? And if you are, great. Where's the attestation? Where's the proof of that? And if we are not, are you accepting that risk? And if you are, guess what? I got no problem with that. Let's write that up. Let's have you sign that so I can include that in my audit findings. So when bad things do happen, we know exactly why. And then there's no mystery about who to blame. right? Because this is about accountability. It's about acceptance of responsibility or the abdication, right? And the turning away from that acceptance, as far as I can tell.
I think that's a great advice. And this is something that we saw many years ago and continues, of course, in manufacturing and so on, where we work with our partners, right, on the engineering side, making sure they understand the design and how it's supposed to work. What you're suggesting, we need to do the same thing on the IT and cybersecurity side, making sure that we understand what our partners are doing or not doing, what kind of infrastructure is in place, and how we may be at risk by virtue of using their products and services. Because like we just highlighted, a lot of things can go poorly, especially when there's lack of transparency. So very good advice there. So as we move into our Q&A section, we have a few comments and some messages from Lauren.
Thank you so much, Adam and Hernan. And to our viewers, if you have any questions, be sure to enter them right now in the chat panel on the right side of your screen. Now, before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to tell you about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is a subscription-based, on-demand CPE learning that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription costs less than a 3-day classroom course, and it allows you to gain access to a library of internal and IT audit, fraud, risk, and cybersecurity learning at any time from anywhere. Visit acilearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV and request your free demo to see what all the fuss is about. All right, Hernan, let's start with our first question.
Thank you, Lauren. So we have a question from Stacy. The question is, are intrusion detection systems, IDS, worth it, or should we only have intrusion prevention systems, IPS?
So, it's an interesting question, right? We get asked this a lot. I get asked this a lot as I talk to customers. And, depending on whose marketing hype you listen to, you'll actually hear them referred to these days as IDPSs. So systems that essentially combine both functions into one. That's the latest iteration of what we would have seen as two traditionally distinctly different systems being marketed over the last 15 years or so. I think it's fair to say today, Stacy, that most modern intrusion management platforms, just broaden that out for what it is considered to be today, which include a variety of other technologies, enhanced threat intelligence and hunting capabilities, enhanced extended detection and response capabilities, cloud enablement as well as on-premises capabilities, management of endpoints in a variety of formats, as well as operating systems. It's a much broader space today. I think it's fair to say that we want capabilities that are both passive in terms of monitoring, what IDSs provide, but also active in terms of the ability to mitigate identified areas of concern, alerts that are bubbled up, and often automation. And let's not even say often, an absolute must in terms of the capability today, automation to react at point of notification, but with humans in the mix, humans in the chain, to override or to identify areas where we do need to focus resources and make decisions about the kinds of actions that should be taken. That's where these platforms have really morphed and evolved and matured into over the last 5 or 6 years, and that's where we want to see them continue to spend time and grow. And I think it's fair to say we're moving away from just IDS, just IPS. We're seeing a hybrid solution that incorporates all the things I've identified, but is cloud-enabled, meaning it's often cloud-based, but has an on-premises capability, and can be extended based on threat intelligence feeds from vendor input globally based on signals that are coming in from all over the world to fine-tune it in near real time.
Great advice there, Adam. Thank you very much. So we have another question. This one's from Kyle. Should auditors engage the public relations department in anticipation of a cyber breach?
So I'm sure that Hernan's probably going to have something he wants to say about this because this is one of his areas of expertise. I'll just offer my thoughts quickly and give Hernan an opportunity to respond here, Kyle, as well. I do believe that having broader external relationships with an ecosystem that supports the organization in times of plenty and in times of good times, as well as in times of famine, in times that are bad, is the key to success. In other words, you don't want to go hunting, right, for the people that are going to help you dig yourself out of a hole when you're at the bottom of that hole, trying to look up. It's a bad time to figure out who you want to partner with. I do think it's important that you know who is around you and who you can rely on. I don't necessarily think engaging, and I think engaging is an elastic term, right? Because it can mean many things. Are you signing a letter of intent? Are you putting them on retainer? Are you simply having a conversation with them about possibilities and about options? I think there's a lot of latitude and flexibility there, but I think having that relationship, or at least having trusted advisors that you know you can go to give you those recommendations as things perhaps turn the corner and start to indicate that you might need those services, is definitely a best practice I would advocate for my customers. But let's give Hernan an opportunity to voice his opinion about this as well.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, I agree. I believe that the word engage means different things, but we definitely need to converse with them. And this term about collaboration is one that comes to mind readily in my mind as well, because one of the things that we have been advocating for a while in the profession is to make sure we talk to our stakeholders. And of course, public relations will be one of those groups, but there are others that we also need to talk to. And this goes to your point, Adam, in terms of preparedness and know who to reach out to if and when something happens. So we have the cybersecurity team, we have the legal team, whoever handles contracts. We have the insurance group. We are looking at the DevSecOps team and any kind of outside contractors. And you mentioned the word retainer, Adam, and that's, again, another place where we may want to also explore who are the organizations we're going to work with if we need to get someone quickly to investigate and do the forensic work behind a breach or an alleged breach. So all of these groups are very important. But back to Kyle's question, yes, I believe we need to make sure that public relations is on board with what we want to do as an organization to be preemptive if and when something terrible happens. And I keep using if and when because in many respects now we're hearing that being the way we describe cybersecurity dynamics, that is not just a matter of if things happen, but when things happen, because unfortunately, as we indicated at the beginning and throughout today's session, these problems are so widespread, so pervasive that we need to expect that to happen, unfortunately, but that is in many cases the reality of the situation. So very good. Thank you there, Kyle. Another question, this one is from Winston. Question is, does having backups protect organizations against ransomware?
So the old, if I have a backup, am I protected question, Winston. So good question. We get this a lot. I get this a lot. I hear this a lot when I'm speaking, when I'm out working with customers in the field, when I'm teaching. The short answer on this is it depends. The long answer is it depends. And then we have a bigger, broader conversation, right? But the bottom line here is it depends on the kind of backups that you're doing, and it depends on the kind of ransomware infection or attack you have sustained. And really what it comes down to is if you have the information that is affected by the ransomware attack backed up, secured, and available for restoration, and there's integrity and availability associated with that, and you're ongoing testing those to ensure that that is the case, you should be able to recover. Emphasis on the words should be able to. No guarantees, but we hope that would be the case, and it often is the case. I think it's also fair to say that if you are not providing for the right kind of backups, you're not ensuring integrity, you're not testing to ensure restorability, you don't have availability because you don't know whether you actually have good data or not, and the wrong data is attacked. The systems you're not backing up and the configurations you don't have stored securely are the attack or are the target of that attack. Then unfortunately the answer is no. You're out of luck. Either you pay the ransom or you figure out how to rebuild from scratch. And I counsel customers all the time about this. The reality is it is the least likely point of entry that attackers will find to attack you because you're not paying attention to it. Not because it's not the most obvious, but because you're just not paying attention to it. And even if it is the most obvious, it's the one that will often be the most destructive because they will get the broadest level of access and do the most damage. And because of that, if you're not backing up your infrastructure top to bottom, I tell customers, if you need it, and if I took it away from you today, what would you do to find it again? And if you can't answer that question, the answer should be I'm backing it up. And if you're not backing it up, you're inviting the opportunity for a bad actor to take it away from you and to not be able to have access to it again. This is why we categorize as well as classify assets broadly, whether they're information or others. Categorization is all about understanding the impact of loss. Classification is understanding the impact of confidentiality and secure access. And those two together are critical to understanding how to combat things like ransomware.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam. We have a question from Jason. Can you advise on the most common breaches in cloud and best practices to avoid such breaches?
So, Jason, can I advise on the most common breaches in cloud and best practices to avoid them? The obvious tongue-in-cheek answer would be to avoid cloud services, which eliminates the possibility of breaches. But that's not the right way to address this by any means. I think it's fair to say that there is not necessarily one set of common, we'll use air quotes, right, common breaches in cloud. I think S3 buckets are a good example of things that are prevalent, but aren't by no means going to be common across all organizations because not everybody hosts on one cloud platform. I think it's broadly fair to say that misconfiguration, which is really what lies at the heart of an S3 bucket breach more often than not, is probably one of the most common elements that leads to breaches in cloud services, regardless of vendor. As you heard me talk about and heard Hernan and I speak about earlier in the discussion, it is often the case that while cloud providers are doing a really good job more and more of stepping up every day and adding more best practice tools, guidance capabilities as defaults, and accessible training to support them into their systems, I think it's also fair to say that there's a backlog and that there is a unfortunate inability for the customers to understand how to implement that technology, even with the best of intentions and with training. I think the single biggest thing customers can do to have an impact in cloud and cloud security today is to pay attention to vendor guidance, is to pay attention to vendor tooling, is to ask the obvious questions. Do my technologists, do my IT professionals, right? Do they have the skills necessary to operate this platform and to do so securely? In other words, if I was looking today as an external third party and I was asking this question because I wanted to buy your company, would I find the answer to be yes or no, is what I tell my customers all the time. And if the answer is yes, I want to challenge that assumption. I want you to show me proof. Show me what they've done. Show me training you've given them. Show me technology they've deployed, and show me threats that have been mitigated and risks that have been minimized because they understand how to manage the technology. And if you could do that, I think you're in a great place. If you can't, I think you have a roadmap to figure out how to. Vendors today are providing the tools. We can no longer blame the vendor. We have to blame ourselves if we're not stepping up and doing what we need to do to act the part. And I think if you can do that, you can avoid a lot of these issues. You're still going to have concerns, but you're going to have different concerns, and they're going to be the kind of concerns you can share and therefore distribute the responsibility and accountability load with across your vendor ecosystem. And you can partner to minimize that risk and achieve security.
Very good. Great advice there, Adam. Thank you very much. We have time for just one last question, and it is from Mohammed. Please advise on the role of audit with regards to investigating cybercrime incidents.
So, Mohammed, I believe you said, Hernan, I see Mohammed's name on the screen. So, Mohammed, great question. I'm going to give you a very quick answer. I'm going to let Hernan have the last word about this because he spends time in this space as well. I think the role of audit in investigation of cybercrime incidents and cyber forensics, as you heard Hernan mention at some point earlier, I think is becoming even more so a critical role and function of audit. I think it's one that's been underplayed and underaddressed in audit in general because we tend to focus on showing up, verifying, and then documenting our findings. We don't tend to play up as much the part of the audit and the audit team with regards to investigation of incidents and incident response. But the telling of that story and the unwinding of that timeline and the use of auditable findings that have been created at a point in the past to reference against is often the difference between success and failure in many incident response investigations. So I think it has an underappreciated role. I think it's one that's becoming more in focus, and I think it's one that will continue to grow in importance as we continue to refine our incident response capabilities. But let's let Hernan have the last word on this.
Thank you, Adam. I agree with you. Yes, audit has a very important role to play. Part of that is from a coordination perspective in terms of making sure that all the key stakeholders are sufficiently involved in identifying vulnerabilities and threats and also having a response mechanism in place and ready to go. So Adam mentioned this in passing several times throughout today's session in terms of making sure that there are policies in place and we have the right SLAs and contracts in place and that we're acting on those, specifically with regards to how we're doing vulnerability assessments and penetration testing and other kinds of testing that we need to do to verify that the configuration is correct, that the people who have access have only the access that they need. So compromised credentials is a big problem. So credentialing and how is that done within the organization and how the third parties do it. So those attestations are very important. Making sure the training is happening. So all of the dynamics that are triggered by poor social engineering knowledge on the part of employees, primarily in many cases, but vendors too. Social engineering and awareness training. How we handle data. So accidental data loss. We need to verify that we are taking good care of that data because that's an asset. And of course, a data breach will be very expensive, as we indicated several times. We have the third-party relationship, which I spoke, and of course, malicious insider, and how we go about detecting and, more importantly, preventing. But we have the XDR, which is extended mechanisms now, and automation. Raising awareness and making sure that the information in terms of what's happening, what could and should be done, gets to the audit committee so they can make appropriate decisions and make sure that the proper mechanisms are put in place to protect the organization and its assets. So a great question, Mohammed. Thank you very much. And to the rest of the people who asked questions, those were fantastic questions all along. Adam, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us. We definitely learned quite a bit, and all of those lessons are going to be learned and put to good use. And to viewers, thank you for joining us, and I hope you do so again when we have another session. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You will receive a link delivered to your inbox. See you next time.